At the beginning of March, Russia announced that it would be cutting its oil output by a total of 471,000 barrels per day. This immediately led to speculation about why exactly Russia was doing this. Two theories dominated the conversation. First, Russia is struggling to keep its oil industry going under the pressure of Western economic sanctions. Second, it is part of a broader OPEC plan to curtail supply, thereby spiking global prices and allowing Russia to ultimately bring in more profit. When faced with two competing theories, a good strategy is to think about the implications that should be happening under one of those mechanisms, but not for the other. Then we check whether that thing is happening, and we ultimately get a better idea about which theory is driving the process. And to spoil the rest of the video, if the OPEC supply cuts theory is the driving force, then Russia should be benefiting from the deep cuts that other countries are making. However, it is Russia that is making the deeper cuts, which suggests that the OPEC theory is a bust. Now, we cannot say definitively that Russia's oil industry is falling apart from the inside. But this is another suggestive piece of evidence in a broader geopolitical puzzle. So today, we will discuss exactly what has happened in recent oil politics. The basic argument as to why Russia may have hidden struggles with its oil industry. Why, at first blush, it seems that Russia might have a weak bargaining position vis-a-vis the rest of OPEC. But then how the war counterintuitively improves Russia's position, again vis-a-vis the rest of OPEC. A meta-problem where the mere possibility that Russia cannot maintain its infrastructure could cause cartel behavior to collapse, even if Russia is capable, and what this suggests about the war more broadly. But we begin with the facts on the ground. Our story starts in 2023, when the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries' more expansive group, OPEC+, announced a collective million-barrel-per-day cut in output, on top of a 2 million barrel per day cut the previous year. Further on top of all of that, Saudi Arabia cut an extra million, while Russia trimmed 500,000. The underlying logic here is that OPEC is a cartel, and the members are trying to implement cartel pricing. Some Econ 101. Monopolists restrict the supply of a good so that overall profit is maximized. When two firms sell the same good, though, each normally tries to maximize its own profits, subject to expectations about how much the other firm will produce. So, with a monopoly, you tend to get little production. However, competition results in more overall production, and thus lower prices for consumers, but less collective profits for the firms. This is not good for the firms, of course. Yep, gotta feel sad for those robber barons. But there is a solution here. You form a cartel. The cartel then coordinates to restrict production to what a monopolist would do, thereby spiking prices, and also each firm's profit sheet. This is the same basic idea with OPEC, except now we are talking about countries and oil. The plot thickened in March 2024. OPEC Plus announced a continuation of the earlier cuts. But the intrigue came from Russia and its aforementioned 471,000 barrel per day cut, slowly ramping up from 350,000 in April to 400,000 in May, before hitting the cited figure in June. Note that the vast majority of this is coming from raw production, so this is not just a repeat of February's export ban announcement, where Russia declared that it will keep all gasoline that it produces, though this will be another part of the puzzle momentarily. Speaking of which, let's get to the theories for why the cut is happening, beginning with lost Russian capacity. For clarity, I am not talking about Ukraine's ongoing drone campaign against Russian oil infrastructure. This has been substantial, as we are observing now, and it is taking its own major toll. It may also be exacerbating the central issue that I do want to focus on. And actually, some of these incidents are unclaimed and unconfirmed, meaning that Ukraine has taken credit for some of the explosions, but not all of them. As such, those that remain are possibly the result of something else. It is also worth noting that I originally began sketching out this video in early March. Then Ukraine really ramped up the attacks, either because Kyiv identified that the strategy was working, or to maximize the disruptions on the eve of the election in Russia. In any case, it is a lot of damage, and I would wager that the timeline you are watching now is probably already outdated. There are just that many of these attacks. With that caveat aside, to explore the underlying logic of what is happening here, we need to transport ourselves back to the glory years and then to the waning days of the Soviet Union. In the West, the 1970s are known as a turbulent time for energy policy. But for the gigantic landmass known as the Soviet Union, full of beautiful overlooks like this one that just so happened to be sitting on top of vast seas of oil, it was a period of prosperity. Moscow did the logical thing. Taking advantage of the high global oil prices, it got drilling. They were not exactly filling the coffers. Money seemed to be leaving just as fast as it was arriving. After all, there was a high price to pay for Moscow to maintain control over its bloc. But it looked like a sustainable geopolitical model. With all of that production came a need for well-trained oil engineers. This was the era of the Iron Curtain, though, which meant that the talent was necessarily being grown at home. But then the 1980s oil glut rolled around, and prices plummeted. The Soviet Union had no choice but to slam the brakes on new oil production. The workforce stayed stagnant, and the oil industry became a less attractive career path. At a higher level, the sagging oil market meant that the Soviet geopolitical hierarchy had become unsustainable. And if you will permit me to summarize 10 of the most consequential years in world history in under 10 seconds, that is how we ended up with Secretary Gorbachev, failed reforms to the Soviet Union, an August coup, and finally President Yeltsin. The Soviet oil industry turned into the Russian oil industry and immediately faced three major shocks. First, with markets liberalizing, Russian oil companies had to face the music and begin bearing the competitive pressures of Western firms. Now, that did not mean an invasion of Western logos was about to take place. There is a reason that Gazprom still exists. But it did mean that much of the technical work could be outsourced to the more capable Western companies. Simultaneously, the Russian economy fell apart, and the Soviet education system? Well, same story there. All of that made it less attractive, and less possible, for a native Russian to be trained in cutting-edge oil industry technology. But that was fine. Russia could take advantage of its vast natural resources, rely on Western companies to fill the gaps, and still make a ton of money. Indeed, after oil production almost cut in half during the 1990s, by the late 2010s, output had returned to close to the peak Soviet-era levels, at about 11 million barrels per day. But that all changed when the Russian nation attacked. With the war in Ukraine ongoing, the Western response, at least when it came to the Russian oil industry, consisted of four elements: sanctions, 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 and sanctions. Seemingly overnight, Russia's access to Western technological expertise disappeared. And with that came a new question. How long could Russia keep the wells, pumps, and refineries flowing without external assistance? One perspective is that the answer to that question is 2 years. That the cuts that Russia is announcing are not actually a voluntary choice. Rather, the infrastructure is falling apart, and Russian workers are struggling to fix things. However, announcing an industrial failing on that scale would not be politically expedient. Thus, according to this theory, the Kremlin has framed it as a simple part of cartel behavior, Nothing to see here. The other perspective is that Russia's cuts are, in fact, voluntary. At first blush, where the cuts are coming from is indeed consistent with this interpretation. Russia right now is facing a cash crunch. Wars in the modern era do not pay for themselves, and to keep the fire going, Russia is burning through a ton of money. Consequently, Moscow is impatient when it comes to capturing new sources of revenue. A delay of even a year has major implications for Russia's success in Ukraine. Now, from your own personal experiences, you likely have an instinctual understanding that this drains all of your bargaining leverage. To draw an analogy, imagine that 3 people go to buy a car. One tells the dealer that if he does not buy a car right this minute, he will be unable to drive across the state to say goodbye to his beloved pet, the sick bald eagle named Baldy. The second one is moving across the country in a few weeks and wants to drive to his new home. The last one has no urgent need for a car and is just looking to see what is available. You can bet that Baldy's owner is going to get a bad deal, the cross-country guy will get an okay deal, and the casual pursuer will get a good deal. That is because Mr. Casual does not really care much if he buys a car today, tomorrow, next week, or later. If the dealer makes a high-priced offer, he is perfectly happy to just reject it and hold out for something better. That, in turn, forces the dealer to lower the purchase price. In contrast, Baldy's owner is desperate to get over and see his beloved companion. The dealer, who evidently hates freedom, can leverage that desperation to force a higher price. Right now, in terms of patience, Russia is less similar to Mr. Casual, and closer to Baldy's daddy. You see, the same patience principle holds for longer-term agreements between businesses, say regarding the manufacturing of an input product for a second company's finished good. Thus, it seems like Russia should get the short end of any cartel agreement. And that is what appears to be happening. Russia dropped its output in the most recent cuts, without a corresponding drop from Saudi Arabia. Instead, Riyadh just continued its earlier cuts. Again, Russia also continued its own earlier cuts, but went one step further. That will cause a decrease in Russian revenues, but it might be the price that Russia has to pay to continue enjoying cartel prices. Saudi Arabia can simply leverage Russia's impatience to force Moscow to bear the bulk of the sacrifice. Welcome to the tragedy of bargaining, where the more powerful get more powerful, and the weak get weaker. Though whether it is a tragedy in this case will depend on how you feel about the war more broadly. In any case, it would seem like we have not made much progress on discerning between the two theories, because both would seem to imply Russia unilaterally curtailing production. However, these types of oil negotiations are not like a standard business agreement or car sale. Oddly enough, impatience may be a virtue here. The difference between negotiating over a traditional business deal and negotiating in international relations is that the former type of contract has external enforcement. If one company betrays the deal, the aggrieved party can go to court and receive compensation. The vast majority of the time, that forces the business to do what the signed paper says it is supposed to do. On the other hand, despite a proliferation of institutions since the end of the Cold War, the realm of international relations does not have such external enforcement. Yes, international courts exist. It is just that rulings from them do not come along with a third-party police force to guarantee a remedy. As a result, international agreements, including like those of a cartel, need to be self-enforcing to work. And that actually flips the weakness of impatience from before. We have discussed this basic idea in the past, but here is a summary. If cartel agreements fail, you have competitive outputs and competitive profits. Not good for either country. If cartel agreements are upheld, then the parties agree to divide the monopoly outputs in a manner that generates more profits for both than compared to normal competition. However, the temptation for either party is to flood the market, while the other side has cut production, under the false impression that the cartel would be upheld. The renegade country will find doing so to be very profitable in the short term. The downside is that the other country will not appreciate the paltry profits that it receives. Looking at just the renegade country, this kills the nice cartel profits and leads to lower profits in the long run. Thus, whether cartel agreements are self-enforcing depends on the patience of the country. An impatient country will prefer obtaining the short-term profits because, relatively speaking, it does not care about the long-term decline. This is not good for the other country either because it leaves them stuck with the bad market pricing. But there is something that the other side can do to alleviate the problem. Give away a greater share of the cartel profits. I know that does not sound ideal, but it can be better than the alternative. The thing is that this division is not set in stone. The parties can alter it, giving one side a little more or a little less, subject to the compliance constraint that is our focus right now. Enhancing Russia's share makes it less attractive for Russia to break the agreement, despite Russia's own impatience. Why does Saudi Arabia go along with this, given that the cartel now looks less attractive from its point of view? Well, as I just previewed a moment ago, its smaller share of profits under the cartel is still better than what it gets by abandoning the process entirely. In turn, and counterintuitively, Russia's need to fund the war in Ukraine is a strength here. If Saudi Arabia does not concede a larger share of the cartel profits to Russia, then it cannot enforce Moscow's compliance with the deal. Everything would fall apart, and both sides would flood the market with oil. But here is the important point. We are not observing this right now. Remember, Russia is the one making further cuts to its output. That is consistent with the troubled capacity theory, but not the cartel business theory. Of course, this is not definitive proof for or against either of the explanations, but it is a piece of the puzzle worth adding to the discussion. One interesting aspect of the general confusion regarding Russia's capacity is that the doubt itself is a problem for maintaining cartel prices. Think of this from Riyadh's perspective. Policymakers there see that Russia's output is declining. They too are wondering which explanation is driving Russia's behavior. If the working theory is that of failed capacity, then Russia no longer has the ability to flood the market to punish Saudi Arabia for overproduction. As a result, making a power play for greater profits sounds like a tempting proposition. However, imagine that Russia is in fact capable and does not want to let Riyadh wrestle away those profits. This puts Moscow in a tough spot. If Saudi Arabia knew the truth, they could continue cooperating on cartel pricing. But because Saudi Arabia is skeptical, its production is going to increase, and Russia will ultimately have to match that production to prove that its capacity still exists. You end up with competitive prices, even though both would be better off if Saudi Arabia just understood the reality of the situation from the start. In other words, global doubt about Russian capacity may cause damage similar to what actual diminished capacity would do. But that is still an ongoing question that will not be answered until the next round of decisions on oil production, so hold tight for a bit. As for the main implications for the war, Russia's potentially crippled oil infrastructure would be good news for Ukraine. The less money Russia has to fund the war effort, the better the position that Kyiv is in. But you can bet that the intelligence services in Kyiv are hard at work, trying to figure out which explanation is correct. The main problem here is the lack of material support. Ukraine has a limited number of long-range drones, and the West has been specifically cautious about giving weapons to Ukraine that could reach targets inside of internationally recognized Russia. Consequently, there are more oil facilities and weapon manufacturing plants than Ukraine has bombs that can reach them. Now, Kyiv has been targeting weapons facilities as well, but if Russia is losing the ability to repair oil infrastructure, suddenly that becomes a more attractive target for Ukraine, precisely because any damage will be longer lasting. In contrast, a tank facility may go offline for a couple of days, and then get right back to work. It is a tough choice for Ukraine that would be made easier with a clean answer to today's big question. Speaking of tough choices, which of these books would you want to read first? I guess that depends on how much you like lines on maps. Regardless, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.